we said before, we are quite happy to have you here for this effort for you because we know that you are quite busy. But we are really excited to have you both here, Kinchi Lau and Jade Margaret Tsui. Um, this is the second interview that we made in the framework of the International Seminar on Popular Economies, which is organized between CLACSO Working Group on Popular Economies and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation from the Andean region of Latin America, and also from International Miranda Center. This is a co-organized seminar, and the first interview that we had was with Alessandra Mesadri, which was based on social reproduction crisis. That was the main theme on that first interview. And in this second interview, we will be discussing a little about the relation between popular economies and rural communities, communality, and all the peasant struggles. So in this second interview, we will have Lau Kinchi, which is the program coordinator for the Center for Cultural Research and Development, and she's also adjunct associate professor of cultural studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, China. She is a member of the International Board of Peace Women across the globe and one of the founding members of the Global University for Sustainability. Thank you very much, Kinchi. And we also have Tsui, Jade Margaret. She's an associate professor of the Institute of Rural Reconstruction of China, Southwest University in Chongqing, China. She's also a board member of the Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, ARENA. She's a founding member of the Global University for Sustainability as well. And they both participated in the book's Experiences of Agrarian Reform in the World, which was coordinated by our mutual friend, Joao Pedro Stedile. And they also participated in the struggle for food sovereignty, alternative development, and the renewal of peasant societies today, which has been actually coordinated by Kinchi Lau and our professor Remy Herrera. So thank you very much for this opportunity to have you here and have this open conversation. So for us, this conversation is quite meaningful as we consider these two professors, authors and committed activists, are key for analytical references for understanding of territorialities of popular economies, communal land, and other forms of communality and collective organization from both rural and urban areas. These have been part of the discussions of the second session of the virtual seminar entitled Popular Economies in Latin America Between the Common and the Capital, organized by the Working Group of the Latin America Council of Social Science, CLACSO in Spanish. This seminar is called Popular Economies, Theoretical and Practical Mapping. Sorry, this is the name of the working group. And also the Andean offices of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and as well the Miranda International Center. This seminar consists of video forums and interviews such as this one. The first session explores commonalities, labor dynamics, and the crisis of social reproduction. In the second session, deals with issues related to popular infrastructures, political organizations towards self-management. And the third session will be centered on public policies, financialization, and popular economies. So for this interview, we think that it's necessary to maybe clarify our notion on popular economies by pointing out what we understand this as heterogeneous social and political formations that constitute networks of processes and practices meant for achieving the reproduction of life in the midst of highly precarious contexts. At present times, these economies are both some of the main territories of the crisis and the primary space of response to its most devastating effects for vast majorities in Latin America. They can also constitute important actors in the dialogue with government policies, and at the same time, these economies often work on building self-managing infrastructures. They usually play a leading role in family-based agriculture and food distribution, both in rural and urban sectors. And at the same time, they are severely affected by the blockade of mobility, militarization of public spaces, and other quarantine-related policies. Popular economies have often been the first to see their income reduced at the same time. They have been some of the most dynamic organizations in terms of providing solutions for their communities. This is part of the definition that we have built in the working group on popular economies of CLACSO. And now, for start this conversation, we have some questions for you. You can choose if each question is answered by the two of you, or you prefer to split it. It's okay for us. So the first one, it's about popular economies in the global south. At this point, many experts and intellectuals have pointed out the global pandemic has exacerbated the civilizational crisis of capital. And this situation has proven how dangerous for sustainability of the social reproduction regime. So what do you think is the role of popular economies in the global south, especially in rural communities, amidst the crisis of social reproduction?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to this interview. And we are very glad to be having these exchanges between movements from Asia and from Latin America. On the question of the crisis, I think we can all see that now we are in this deep crisis of the pandemic. But then this pandemic is not only about the virus, it is also the whole question about the crisis of capitalism. So before the pandemic set in, we already saw the implosion of the capitalist crisis, as Samir Min had put it, and we have seen that the agricultural question has been very much exacerbated due to the question of finance capital. So I think what we are dealing with here is a multi-dimensional explosions of the crisis in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the question of implosion of the economic crisis, in terms of the question of climate change and ecological crisis. And so so I think when we discuss the questions of alternatives, we have to look at all these manifestations, but then try to see the root and where we can be addressing them. So one question is to try to understand the crisis in terms of the manifestations. But at the same time, when we look for alternatives, we also have to look at the question of subjectivities. Who will be the agents for change? So on the one hand, we see the majority of people, especially those in the global south, and especially those from rural communities, from urban slums, from the indigenous communities, that is those at the periphery being the main victims of these crises. And on the other hand, we are now faced not with questions about higher standards of living, decent livelihood, etc. We are faced with the question of subsistence. It is the question of survival and subsistence for the majority of the population, both on the question of the pandemic, and also on the question of hunger and starvation. So that is why we think the whole question about food sovereignty is of primary concern. And maybe we could try to look at the question of crisis from the question of food sovereignty.
Thank you very much. Do you want to, maybe you want to complement Suisi?
Kinchi talked about the importance of food sovereignty, but I think before we talk about it, we should think about the land issue, particularly the land reform or land revolution, and based on the experience in the last century, I mean the 20th century. So when we talk about the food sovereignty, at the same time, we have to talk about the land struggle in the last century. That means the 20th century. And based on the land revolution, I think we can look into the experience of China and also the Vietnam. But today, maybe we can discuss more about the China experience. So as you know that the China's fighting the COVID-19, and then to a certain extent we can control it, and also nowadays Chinese people can move around within China territory. So we have also think about that why China can has measure or can contain COVID-19. And many people haven't thought about actually because we have land revolution in 1949. Why? Because it let us, the majority has more living space in the countryside and also have the access to land and also food security. I think space and food has guaranteed the majority when we fight against the COVID-19 or pandemic. And of course, we also have the tradition, the TCM, that means the traditional Chinese medicine. So this is all contribute to why China can, to a certain extent, successfully contain COVID-19. And so when we talk about the food sovereignty, we have to answer the questions, to what extent the people can achieve the land revolution or the land reform. That means the majority has the access to land and also the food, and particularly the staple food. So in China, based on our experience, whenever we have a crisis, and most probably the rural China absorb this kind of crisis, particularly economic crisis. And because of land revolution, we have this society that means we have two twin pyramids of stability in contemporary China. That means the majority has the land resources and have the food security. On the other hand, the industrial and also the financial sector actually is state control. That means state and also village enjoy the collective ownership of resources, collective ownership of land resources. This is very important. And on the other hand, the state also control the financial sovereignty. This is also very important.
Jade,
Yeah.
maybe one necessary question before, maybe for us in Latin America that doesn't know the reality and history of China, maybe you can tell us what could be the pillars of the land revolution in China, maybe to understand a little how is the land regime ownership in China.
As you know that we Chinese has a long history of peasant agriculture, and at least the 4000s. And whenever the change of dynasty, the new emperor should do the land redistribution and taxation exemption. This is two principles for new dynasty. So even the Communist Party also practice in that way. That means once they took power, but because you know that the base of Communist Party of China is the peasant, it's not proletariat. The slogan for mass mobilization is land to the tillers, land to the tillers. So once the Communist Party took power, they keep their promise to do the land redistribution. That means the largest resources is land. So let the majority enjoy or have access to land. This is the first principle. Most probably, many Communist Party also prioritize this principle. So in China, Communist Party still keep that promise. So nowadays, we still have the village committee control land resources. Land is not sale in the market. The ownership, the land ownership belong to village, not individual peasant, not the state, belong to the village committee. This is very important. That means village committee control the land resources. It belongs to the collective. And in the city, the urban area, the urban land belong to the state. Both practice the collective ownership. I think this is very, very important.
Quite easy.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that explanation for us here in Latin America. So you can go on because I interrupt you.
Yeah. Many people think that China is very strong, very powerful, but fundamentally, actually, we are a big country, but with many, many small peasants. So we still have the 230 million peasant households. So it's a really, really large number. And but these peasants has their own small plot of land and also have their own housing. So this is the legacy of land revolution of 1949. I think we also have to remember this. So this is our base, not because of the we have a high technology. We have of course we try to develop the high technology and let the high technology in our hands. But we also, at the same time, we also emphasize that we should control our food security. So, but now in terms of the food sovereignty, I will show you this picture. In terms of rice, wheat, corn, actually we can produce our own food. That means we don't export from the overseas markets. However, in terms of soybean, it's really, really very sad because we import a lot, and then we consume 1/3 of the world production. And this, you know that we import from United States, from Brazil, from Argentina, but you know that those soybean actually controlled by the transnational agribusiness, ABCD agribusiness companies. So the pricing is not controlled by us, but we at the same time, we also try, the Chinese soybean producer also try to get back this the soybean sovereignty. We also try to encourage our the soybean producers to produce more the domestic soybean, but it's not easy. And so to a certain extent, I'm quite understand when you start to produce your own food, it takes time. It's also, you have to change the culture. It's a not easy task, but I think we also already try towards this kind of strategy. So this is a great change, particularly for the few years, because we are under US attack, also US the sanctions, and then many, the Chinese people food security in our hand? How can we develop our own technology, high-tech technology? I think for the last 2 years, thanks to Trump, it forced us to develop, our own path for alternative. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. With this, I have many questions to keep into the script. I was thinking maybe you have give us a little picture of how is the situation of agriculture in China, but maybe I can ask you, what do you think it's the importance of the participation of small peasants and family-based agriculture in all Asia? Because I know that as well as you work in China, you also have a little work in the rest of the continent. So maybe you can give us a little picture about it.
Yes, I think just now Jade has talked about the question of China, and I think on the one hand, so she made two main points. One is the land, the rural land, still belongs to the village collective, and so the 250 million peasant households still have their access to the plot of land. Although, of course, in the recent years, there has been the legal permission for so-called circulation of land. That means there will be certain transactions of the use of rural land. So, for example, when some peasants, they decide to go to the cities as migrant laborers, then they may contract the land to their neighbors or to some corporations. And so we've had some statistics which says that maybe about 1/3 of the rural land has been circulated to some others, some other people from the rightful users. And so this is still the situation, and yet of the peasants having direct access to their own land. And so this is a feature which has undergone certain changes, but still it is the main gain of the 1949 revolution with the redistribution of land to peasants. But then, on the other hand, in China, we just mentioned the problem of the question of food sovereignty. And so in terms of the main staple food, I think China still has about 80% of self-sufficiency on the main food provisions. And yet, in some areas, then there has been very drastic change. So, for example, just now, Jade mentioned the question of the soya bean. And of course, if you ever go to a Chinese restaurant, you would most probably order the dish of tofu, the bean curd. And so soya bean made food has been one main food in Chinese cuisine. And so we have soya milk and soya bean made food. And yet now, I think for over 20 years, the soya bean has been controlled by multinationals, and China, instead of being self-sufficient on its on its own production of soya bean, has now lost its sovereignty over this very important daily consumption item. And this is quite a long story. So if you like later, we can give more explanation as to how China lost this by being by some manipulations in the stock market pricing by the multinationals. So there was a huge loss inflicted on the Chinese buyers when there was the manipulation of the soya bean pricing, and so China lost its control. So, and that
So
happened over 20 years ago. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kinchi, but that's a quite interesting discussion. And as well, it makes me think in right now in here in Latin America, specifically in Argentina, they have a big discussion over this project that they are promoting, which is which consists in build some big farms for the growing of pigs, of big pigs, in order to import them to China. And that's kind of a very, very crucial discussion right now for the Argentinian people, and specifically for political organization, because they think they are discussing about how this affects the sovereignty of production in Argentina. And it also makes me think that it's quite weird because we know that the pork meat, it's also a very important item in the consumption in China. So it's quite interesting how to think how you prefer to have your pigs from Argentina than in China.
Okay.
So sorry for the
that is also a question, and I think I'm very glad you raised this question because on the one hand, that's the question about the soybeans. And so I think for soybeans, I think Brazil was also trying to grow a lot of soybeans. And now we've heard that Russia is also going into some negotiation with China to say that Russia can lease huge pieces of land for China to grow soybeans so that Russia could export soybeans to China instead of having China being so dependent on the US and on Brazil. So you see these global shifts. And then you raised the question about the pork. Well, pork has been, always an important food item in China. And even in the past, maybe 30 years ago, when generally the consumption level was quite low, still for the peasant households, they might raise 1 or 2 pigs so that during the Chinese New Year, the whole family could have meat. So it might not appear daily on the dinner table, but then certainly you would have pork at the end of the year. I mean, at the beginning of the new year. And of course, now with the rising standard of living, so you have much more pork, and also, of course, more chickens, more beef, and more lamb. But pork still is the main item for Chinese cuisine. But then this is also another area where China has lost its sovereignty, the pork sovereignty, because just in 2019, that is last year alone, the USA has exported to China 6.6 million tons of pork, which amounted to $1.45 billion US. And so in a way, what we are seeing is that it's the same situation as the soybean. Chinese farmers are not growing soybeans so much now, and also because the imported soybeans would be much cheaper than the locally grown soybeans. And it's the same thing that's happening with the pigs. The local Chinese breed of pigs, they are being phased out. And we are having over 98% of the breeders, the breed being imported from outside. And so if, for example, in this China-US trade war, if US decides to stop sending China the pigs for the breeding, then China would face a major problem on the question of pigs. So we see that but then, fortunately, China still has its sovereignty over rice and wheat, etc. But then there's also a pressure to import more and more. And so here I would like to quote the Lau y Campesinas proposal of ending the WTO policies on agricultural products, because I think Lau y Campesina has been proposing that agriculture should be withdrawn from the WTO, and especially the agro fuels should be banned, and the control of technology, pricing, and market by transnational agribusiness corporations should be rejected. And on this question, I would like to talk also about some countries in Asia. So in India, in Nepal, for example, then they still have to go through the agrarian reform because land distribution is still very uneven. So we still have, and so the question of agrarian reform so that land is accessible to the majority of the small peasant families is still on the agenda. In Nepal, despite the change of the monarchy, despite the fact that the leftist parties have been in power for quite some time, we still haven't had the constitutional change for the agrarian reform. And in India, we still see that this is still a major question. And so land is still the major demand for by the peasants. In Korea, in Japan, then we see that there has been the distribution of land. And so basically in East Asia, we see there has been the land reform and the peasants have had access to land, but still in some areas, they share the same predicament as peasants in India and Nepal. So we know that there is a very high rate of peasant suicides in different parts of Asia, whether that is in Japan, South Korea, or in India, Nepal. In India, the situation is very difficult. So from our friend P. Sainite, who's an Indian journalist who has been working a lot on documenting the questions of predicament of the farmers. He wrote that since the neoliberal policy, since the so-called liberalization of policies under the WTO, there has been documented farmer suicides of over 300,000. That is 300,000 farmers in India had committed suicide because they couldn't bear with the situation. But then the farmer suicide question is not only in India. I think many people would be very familiar, would have heard of the story of the WTO meeting in Cancun in Mexico in the year 2003. So we have this South Korean farmer, Lee Kun-hee, who committed suicide on September the 10th in 2003, when there was the WTO meeting in Cancun. He was the president of the Federation of Farmers and Fishermen of Korea. He was a college graduate. He studied in the agricultural college and so after graduation, he took up farming, and he had been campaigning against WTO pressures on Korea to open up its market to foreign agricultural products. So before he committed suicide in 2003, he put up this slogan, this placard, which says, "The WTO kills farmers." Then he committed suicide. So I think many people have heard about him, and he's still he had sacrificed himself in order to draw attention to the predicament. And so we've seen Korean farmers protesting against the import of wheat, the import of beef, and so these policies have been to the benefit of the agribusiness. And so I think this demand of the La Via Campesina is very crucial, and it still should be on the agenda of the fight for food sovereignty. And I would also like to talk about another farmer suicide, which is not directly to deal with the WTO policies, but then it has to do with the questions of nuclear catastrophes. So on March 11, 2011, that is 9 years ago, we had the Fukushima nuclear power plant catastrophe. After that, then the dairy farmers, the organic farmers, the food producers, they were all made victims because the land was so polluted that they could not be continuing with their dairy farming or with their vegetable growing. So just, I think about 14 days after the disaster happened, we have this 12 days after the Fukushima accident, we have this dairy farmer who committed suicide. And he's called Hisashi Tarukawa. And 2 years later, the TEPCO, that is the Tokyo Electric Power Company that was operating the Fukushima nuclear power plant, admitted that it was responsible for the farmer's suicide, and it paid compensation to the farmer's family. But then we also see this predicament of the Japanese farmers. And apart from this farmer who committed suicide because he could no longer engage in his dairy farming, and he had to send his all his dairy cows to for slaughtering. And so he put up this notice he put up this pillar to commemorate the slaughter of his cows, and said that we human beings, we owe you an apology. And after that, he himself committed suicide. But we also know that farmer suicide is also among the higher, the categories of large numbers of suicides. I think in different parts of countries in Asia, despite their differences, whether they had access to land or they don't even have access to land. So for example, in the case of Korean or Japanese farmers, one main question is that they often fall into debts. They are indebted because they have to, driven by the so-called Green Revolution, they are not working on permaculture. They have to rely a lot on getting loans for the machineries, for the pesticides, for the chemical fertilizers. And so very often they get indebted. And then they have also to compete with the low-priced products from outside. And so we have seen the peasants bearing the main brunt of these neoliberal policies. And so I think that is why I feel that today we focus on the question of food sovereignty. And on the question of food sovereignty, I think on the one hand, we should understand the whole logic, the whole ways in which finance capital and also speculative capital have been manipulating in the field of agricultural products. And also on the kind of policies supported, or enforced by WTO and other organizations, for example, on patenting, etc., that have brought us, that have brought all these predicaments. So I think in this sense, Asian farmers face much the same predicament as farmers in Africa, in Latin America, and in the Middle East. So I think on the one hand, when we discuss the questions, I think we have to try to understand what are the kind of forces that have come together to prevent peasants from having access to land, access to food, access to the appropriate technology, and also the question about the market, when even if they could produce on their own land certain products, they couldn't compete with the products imported from outside. So I think this is a whole convergence of global forces and also domestic forces when the multinationals are getting more and more control of certain areas. So I think on the one hand, when we talk about questions of food sovereignty, we have to try to understand the kind of forces that are operating and having this impact and effect on the farmers on the ground. And on the other hand, then understanding about these dynamics, then we would know what would be the main agenda that we would be proposing in order to secure food sovereignty for the peasants. So I think the two questions that we just mentioned, one is the agrarian reform so that peasants have access to land. And that is, I think, the first condition. But then even when they have access to land, then they still need all the means of production. For example, the seeds, the appropriate technology, the questions about workings on irrigation, so that they don't have to, so that they can now also be better positioned to deal with all the climate change effects. So for example, the floods or the famines that are happening all over the world in different regions. And so these are becoming more and more intense. And so that we need a concerted effort. So when we are talking about questions of fighting for land, I think La Via Campesina also proposed a very good slogan. That is, we fight not only for land, we fight for territory. When the question of territory is proposed, then it means that we have also to look at the question of atomized farmers working and fighting desperately on their own land. So when we talk about the question of territory, we talk about the question of communal relationships, the question about collectivism, how collectives could be working to have control over the common resources and also to manage the common so that they can manage it collectively in forms of cooperatives, etc. So I feel that when we talk about these questions, there are different aspects that we have to take into account. So question of land, question of access to seeds and appropriate technology, questions of collective management and collective control of the commons. So I think these are the necessary conditions. And when we are in the midst of the pandemic, which is not showing signs of abating, which are still running, and I think this there is the more need for local productions, for local consumptions, and the local productions should be based on communal efforts, on collective efforts, and there should be the question about how we can also facilitate urban-rural interactions, because the urban now, for example, if we look at India, when they have had this closed down, the government simply announced within 4 hours that we will have to close down, and nobody could be leaving their home. So we have this huge exodus of migrant laborers having to return to their own villages. But then when they return to even if they manage to return to the villages, can they have access to land, and can they produce? So that the whole question about self-sufficiency is now on the agenda. So when we look at the question of dependency, that is the dependency on the market, dependency on the agribusiness, dependency on funds from the state or from the IMF or from the World Bank. Then when we look at all these, then of course it's very difficult, but then it is very necessary that we move in that direction. So I think the food sovereignty question should be taken up seriously by all social movements, and we look at the questions of the pandemic, the questions of finance capital, the question of the crash of the economic systems, and also the questions of climate change, so that we will not be facing huge human catastrophes of huge losses of lives. I think it is very clear that capitalism has never been able to deal with the question of providing decent livelihood or even subsistence to the majority of the population, and in the global south, and also in the south within the north. So I think there need to be this concerted efforts from the global south working together to try to push for these policies. And the state has this responsibility to try to prevent agribusiness multinationals from taking advantage, from to prevent finance capital from the speculation in the national areas. But at the same time, there need to be cross state or international efforts to try to deal with these questions. There need to be this solidarity so that we can fend off this huge human tragedy that we can already see looming in the immediate future.
Speaking about specifically tragedy that we can see right now in the humanity among the capitalism crisis, I would like to ask, what keys do peasant organizations and family-based agriculture add to the current perspective? I mean, regarding the civilizational crisis of capital, do you think, or can you describe some referential experiences in terms of redistribution, reproductive work, concentration of productive land, participation of youth, and participation of youth is important because it's opposed to this trend to the urbanization and a lot of people, a greater mass of unemployment, particularly in the youth, but also what kind of alternative agri-food regimes. I mean, I think that I'm raising the question of alternatives and how community regeneration can have a specific referential experiences, maybe in China, but also in the rest of Asia. So maybe you can highlight some kind of references that we can have at the time about this question. And I will also add the thing about value generation, because one of the trends that we have in here, we are discussing, is a trend to not recognizing the different value generation, the different ways of value generation that we have actually in communities. So it looks like the only way of value, it's about wage, it's about money, but we don't see all the different kind of ways of value generation that we have in rural communities and also in the relation with urban communities. So maybe you can give us you can highlight some experiences in China and Asia about it.
Yes, maybe I'll invite Jade to talk about the Yongji experience, and then later I could also talk about the Zhoujiazhuang experience.
Respond to Kinchi. Kinchi mentioned about the Indian farmer commit suicide. Even quite a lot, and at the same time, quite a lot of the migrants return to the villages, but they still can't survive, even they have land. Because why? Sinai told us that because they produce cash crop. That means they produce cotton or sugarcane or the cash crop, and then they can't have their staple food. So when we talk about land revolution, not only they have access to land, but also they have the land use of right, and also to produce their own staple food. I think that is also very important. We have to remember this. And when we work with the peasants, because Kinchi and I are also committed in rural reconstruction movement in today China for the last 20 years, based on our experience working with rural communities. Most rural communities or villages, they also very emphasize that we produce our own food, our staple food. So even during the pandemic, many cities and villages, they have their own lockdown, but they still can survive because they have access to land and also produce staple food. So it's very, very important. And then the next question is how we let the young generation has the know-how to produce staple food. Not only, not cash crop, but staple food, and how to train young people to raise pig in an organic way. So on the one hand, we work together with the peasant and help them to set up the peasant cooperatives. On the other hand, we also encourage young people to work with the peasant and also the workers. So in the over the last 20 years, we set up James Yan's Rural Reconstruction Institute, and also we set up the Little Donkey Farm. And I remembered Hernan also visited the Little Donkey Farm and also visited the Yongji. And now Yongji is the one of the successful rural communities in today China. And then we have integrated project with Yongji. That means we have three sectors. One's from our side, the Little Donkey Farm, because they provide the training program of natural farming for peasant and young people. And for the another, our organization is named the Liangshu Mi Rural Reconstruction Center, because every year we organize the training program for the graduate and to let them learn the appropriate technology. And one of that program is to how to raise the pig in an organic way. So, and the third sector is the Puhan Rural Community. Puhan Community is original, is a women's dancing club organized by Zheng Bing. She is a primary teacher, but later she think that not apart from dancing, how women also can gather, work together to deal with the public affairs, how to deal with the gambling or alcoholic problem in their villages. So step by step, they include more men and also include many other villages. So it's a kind of a cross-village organization. And also it's a peasant-initiated organization. It's very unique. So now we have this integrated program work together. So on the one hand, we hoped we can train the young generation have that know-how how to produce food. That means food producer is very important for our future. On the other hand, try to think about the employment issue, and also, as Kinji mentions, how can we take back? I mean, to take back this pig raising pig sovereignty, and soybean sovereignty. And that means we have to think about how can we train our young generation to be real food producer, not pro capital, pro speculative value. I mean, this is very important because we, again, to emphasize the importance of neighbor value or neighboring, or the not produce some young people just sit in the office, type computer, and do some speculative activities, and then he or she becomes the rich. So we hope our young people can go to the farm, do the farm work, and also produce their own food, and work together with the other people to again to emphasize or to recognize the importance of collectivity neighbor. So this is our main gain, means the main target, or the future target. And on the other hand, we also reach out to learn experience from India, and for quite a long time we have building friendship with the KSSP, that means Kerala People Science Movement in India, particularly in Kerala State. Kerala State and is one of 3 states has achieved the land reform. That means the majority during the late 1960s, they already have access. The majority has access to land. As I mentioned, the land issue is one of the crucial factors whether you have a condition to fight the COVID-19, because land revolution guarantee more space and guarantee even food for the majority. So I want to emphasize this point. And in Kerala too, when compared with other Indian states, Kerala is a kind of model to successfully fight the COVID-19. And KSSP, as it was set up in 1962, and their slogan is the science for social transformation. And then the voluntarism is also one of the main elements of that movement, because they mobilize many school teachers and government officers, and also the local scientists. So this is kind of a very popular, very large, is a largest, one of the largest popular movement in India. And during the pandemic, they also to work with the state government to produce the community kitchens, because they produce food for the migrants, and also to organize themselves to do this kind of food delivery, how to facilitate the food delivery between villages. So you find that this kind of mobilization is happened at the grassroots level, and we found that this kind of voluntarism also is a legacy of socialism in China too. For even in the Wuhan rural community, once they want to mobilize the villages to do the clean work or cultural activities, most of the time the leaders or the local leaders, mainly they are women, they also practice the voluntarism. So this is also kinds of the fight against the money values, because individualism, consumerism, and also money is God, this kind of culture is also quite predominant, particularly in the city, also in some rural area. So in that sense, how can you mobilize the people not committed in this kind of communal activity is not because of money, but because they want to have a better community to provide goods, the living environment, living condition for the future generation. So this kind of volunteerism is also still exists in our culture, because during 1950 and 60, we have a very strong movement of volunteerism. Otherwise, we can't have this kind of the national industrialization. It's based on volunteerism for whole two generations. So when compare Chinese and Indian experience, we also think that we have to strengthen the base, particularly in rural area. So we support the MP Parliament idea, urban republics. So it's a kind of a synthesis of mass concepts of ending the contradiction between town and country with the Gandhian vision of network of self-reliant village republics. So responding to Kinchi argument that first we have to stop or to end corporate monopoly, and at the same time we have to mobilize young people committed in the communal activities, and also to generate, the community power. Yeah.
We've been speaking about the theme of the different struggles, different alternatives, and different points of policies that could be in dispute from small peasants, and most of the time against capital system of disposition. But last interview, we were talking with Alessandra Mesadri about the theme of how could be an error to think like different theories when we speak about capitalism, and when we spoke about patriarchy, and when we speak about racism and colonialism as well. So she thinks that we can have an error when we try to make double theories or triple theories, because they are all mixed in the territories. I mean, the capitalism, the colonialism, the patriarchy system, the racism. So maybe you can give us some comments about if you think that this is actually a mixture of the different domination systems in the territories, and how this it's in confrontation with the different small peasant struggles and rural community struggles.
We have been trying to say that we agree with the Lavia Campesina's ideas about that we are not fighting for food security, because that is food security is very much loaded with all the propaganda, and also the actual practice of actually growing cash crops in order to sell the cash crops, and then you import to buy your necessary daily items. So I think I think for us to be going for this, I think just now Jade mentioned that in the Puhan experience, they have a network of different villages coming together to do collective purchase of the means of production. But then during the pandemic, they actually try to shift from growing cash crops to growing their own food. So there's this movement of going for local food production, for local consumption. And they also have been trying to attract young people to come back to the communities, their own children that have gone out to study and work, then they ask them to come back. But they also attract any youth from not from the same village to come back and to come here, and then to raise their families. And I think you also met with some of them. We also invited some of them to speak during the South-South forums on sustainability. And so you have young people coming back to the to agriculture, to the rural villages. And I think this trend of having young people coming back, we also saw that in the 1980s and 90s. For example, in Japan, when Japan was suffering from the some economic downturn, what they did was, I think, also that the young people would be going back to the villages. And they also said that the land was very cheap to rent because nobody would really want to work on agriculture. So it was quite inexpensive to rent pieces of land and then to engage in agriculture. So we also have seen this move. And also for example, for India, we have had this phenomenon of suicides by farmers. But P. Sinet also talked about a reversal starting from 2018, that peasants, instead of going for suicide out of despair, they have now been coming up with active protests. And so there have been marches of peasants to New Delhi, to the cities, to demand the land and to demand attention to their plight. So we see these shifts, and I feel that that is also the trend. So on the one hand, when we would be demanding changes in WTO policies, etc., and also for the state to defend the peasants. But then on the other hand, I think what we can all be engaged in is at the local level. So at the local level, we also see, for example, with the in Thailand, there's the Thai Volunteer Service, which is very famous. They have been working on the promoting urban-rural exchanges, and they have also been working in Myanmar and also in Indochina. And some of their projects are also in encouraging young people to go back to the villages to do farming. Actually, today, we are now in the evening time. In the daytime, for 6 hours, I took 25 students in my classes in Hong Kong to go to a local organic farm to learn to do farming. And the main person responsible in the farm is a student that I supervised who did his PhD on Hong Kong agriculture. But after finishing his PhD, he said that he would enjoy so much being a full-time farmer. And so he's a full-time organic farmer, now with a PhD. And so we also see, for example, in Hong Kong, there's the renewed interest in going for agriculture, because I think there's also a shift in values. That people now do not see being a peasant to be backward, to be and so I think this is maybe one of the outcomes of of people seeing the failures of modernization, the failures of all these promises of urbanization, modernization, globalization, and now young people couldn't even find a job after graduation. So I think it is by seeing the failures of the capitalist system that we are also having more young people looking for alternatives. And then they now see that being food producers is an honor. It is not doing something backward, something that but then that would be considered or regarded as being low status, but that it would be a symbol, a sign of your independence, of your autonomy, your being free from dependency on the state or on other on finding a job in the office, which is getting more and more difficult. So of course, this is still a minority that's going back to agriculture, but then we can see this shift in values. So I think we also talked about the urban-rural interactions, and I feel that as an overall strategy, we should go for degrowth and de-urbanization, going back to small towns and also to turning urban towns into transition towns where you would have urban agriculture, etc. So we have very good experiences that we can learn from, for example, in Cuba and in Venezuela, when there has been the sanctions and also the question about peak oil. So we have seen Cuba in the 1990s and Venezuela in the last, especially in the last 10 years, efforts of going for communal agriculture, working on collectives. And so this is not only the question of growing food for your own consumption. It is also about a different approach to the whole question about modernity, that we are now changing human relationships. It's not only human relationships, we are also changing relationships between humans and nature. And so I feel that all these developments, going for local food production, going for against cash crops, against agrofuels, because I think this is the biggest lie of the Green Revolution, when previously, then one of the justifications for Green Revolution was that we would feed the world with this technology, with a scale production in agriculture. And now we see all this agrofuel being on the agenda, and then we are feeding the cars and the planes instead of feeding the people. And so I feel that there is this shift, and it's not only the question of policies above, at the levels above, it's also a major shift in the values, especially of the younger generation, to feel that we want to produce food on our own. We want to have land, and we want to learn the technologies. We want to learn about technologies that will free us from dependency on microcredit, on dependency on pesticides and the insecticides and chemical fertilizers. We want to start to have our own seeds. And so I think also the seed movement is so important in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. That is also one of the central struggles. And from Latin America, actually, there have been a lot of experiences that we are learning from. So we are now having this series on South-South dialogue and learning about Venezuela, learning about the communes that are trying to produce food under very difficult circumstances. The Masao communes, the cooperatives in the urban areas, and these are experiences that are very encouraging, and these are experiences that give us hope and the confidence that we can do it despite all the difficulties. So if the Zapatistas could do it, if the Venezuelan peasants could do it, the youth in Cuba could do it, could work on urban agriculture, and the status of farmers as food producers has come up in these difficult times, that they are no longer being looked down on, that they can be that they will be working as collectively, then I think it is a major change. So in China, for example, we have just published a series of articles on monthly review in the October issue. So we talked about China, and Jade talked about the experience of the Puhan. And I also wrote an article on Zhouzhazhuang, which is the last people's commune in China. And there they have 4,500 households. They have kept this collective running since 1956, and they have managed to keep the collective assets and not divide into individual households in 1982, when I think about over 95% of people's communes were dismantled. And so we had the household responsibility contract system, whereas in Zhouzhazhuang, which is not 2 hours from Beijing, so of driving from Beijing, they have kept this collective, because they said that it's not because well, they are particularly heroic in hanging on to collectivism. It's because they see the superiority of this collective system, where they have the land, the irrigation, the production being planned at the township level, and then the tasks being taken up by the individual production brigades at the levels where they have about 400 households for each brigade, and they could intervene in the daily management of the production. So there we see that even though cash crops, the production of cash crops is a big attraction, because you can sell and then get a lot of money. And so the idea was that usually if you look at it only in monetary terms, in immediate short-term visions, you would go for cash crops, because then you can get a lot of money, and then you can buy your food as well as other things. You can send your children to school, etc. But then in this Zhouzhazhuang commune, they have adhered to the collective form, because they feel that it is more superior. And most importantly, each brigade would produce, first of all, enough food for their own consumption. They produce enough corn, beans, and also some vegetables, some watermelon, some millet, etc., which would serve for their own needs. So that for these basic items, they do not go to the market. And then for the rest of the land, then they would grow wheat or other things for seeds, for cash crops. But then they would first ensure that they have their own food sovereignty. And so I think, for example, this kind of approach could be very good examples for us to learn from, how we can at least ensure our own food production, so that we can guarantee our own subsistence. And then for maybe the remaining land, we could grow other things, we could do other things with that. So I feel that we need this turn to localization. So that is also where we like this concept by MP Parameswaran, who's our friend from India. And he's a nuclear scientist, but then he decided to go not for nuclear weapon making, but for the people's science, promoting self-sufficiency in the local villages. And they placed a lot of attention, they pay a lot of attention on questions about watershed, about appropriate technology, about the production of necessary items for their own consumption. So it's not only rice that they produce for themselves, they also they do the homemade soap and washing powder, etc., so that they don't have to rely on these commodities. So I feel that we should go for the commodification of daily necessary items. We should go for the urbanization. because urban life basically is very parasitic, and in the days of pandemic, we find that we are in trouble. But then there also need to be drastic changes in lifestyles, especially the wasteful lifestyles and consumption life patterns. So I feel that on the one hand, we should be fighting for these changes in the global policies, in the state policies, in fending off the encroachment of finance capital. But on the other hand, I think we don't have to wait for these changes. We could be going for the communal efforts, both in urban and in rural areas, so that we could already be trying to look for all the cracks and crevices in the current system, and we can take action. Because I think nobody's going to save us. The multinationals, they're not going to save us. They look only at profit. Finance capitalism, they're not going to save us. And sometimes even our state may not be able to save us. So we are the only, we have to be the protagonists to find ways to save ourselves. And I want to also stress the question about ecology. We are facing very profound ecological crisis, and so we are also talking about how we do not go beyond 2 degrees increase in the global temperature, because if we increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees, it would mean the end. It would mean almost the end of most species and possible end of humanity. And that we are already warning that there's already the warning that that could be happening in 30 or 50 years. So we are now faced with pandemic in the next 1 or 3 years, but then we are facing this ecological challenge, which could end humanity in 30 or 50 years. And we have the young people, we have the children of 10, 15, and they're telling us, can we have a future? Can you as adults, can your generation leave a planet that is sustainable enough for us still to have a future? So I think that is the question we have to answer to the next generations.
Thank you very much, Kinchi. So it's been quite a wonderful conversation. Maybe if you allow me, I just want to introduce a final issue in order that you can give us some final comments. We've been thinking about some different stuff that you have been talking about and that you have been actually working on. One of them is that, as you said before, actually, I can say from my own experience that I'm a part of an urban platform here in Venezuela, and we used to talk about the necessity of democratization of city, the urban democratization, which is an idea that has been planted by Lefebvre in the 90s. But after a while, we've been discussing and we said, we don't need to democratize this kind of city. We don't need to be part of this kind of urbanization. We need to have an urban revolution. We need to have another kind of development in the territory that is not to spread the same kind of urban pattern. So I think that maybe in our society, when we think about development, we think about progress. And we think about progress is to think about urbanization. And urbanization is, of course, as you said, ways of life and ways of reproduction that are quite different than actually the social reproduction of life. So I couldn't hold myself to speak a little about this. But also, I want to say that one of the main theses that you have been working on during the last years is how in China specifically, the different cyclical crisis of capital has been supported by the rural China, kind of this other China that you have been talking to us about. But I would like to say that maybe if we think in that thesis, we can think that maybe that actually happens in a global scale, because most of the crisis of capital has been supported by our rural communities, not only in China, but also in Latin America and maybe the global south. But we can also add that maybe most of the crisis has been supported by the different ways of value generation, not only in the rural side, but also in the urban side. What I'm trying to say is that maybe we can, if you allow us to extract this thesis and think that maybe how the reproduction of capital actually is supported on the reproduction of life that actually happens in our rural communities, in our urban communities as well. So maybe with these two ideas, I want to ask you for a final comment in order to close this very fine and very productive conversation. So please be my guest.
Okay. Our thesis, actually, we had invited Professor Wente Jin to give 11 lectures on the economic crisis in China in terms of the different cycles. And of course, now we are currently in the cycle of post 2013. And so we also have written different papers, so I'm not going to go into the details. But then if you are interested, you could also go see the Global University's recording of the lectures in English. We are also going to produce the book in English, and of course we would welcome your translating it into Spanish. The thesis that we have is that the urbanization or modernization has been carried out in China, in India, in all parts of the world at the expense of the peasants, at the expense of agriculture, at the expense of the rural. So in our discussions about China, we also try to show how the building of the industrial capacities has taken resources from the rural. So so that is, I think, as you just pointed out, that has happened also everywhere in the world. But now what we are seeing is that in the past we talked about the labor forces, but now we are also talking about the dispossessed, the people in the informal sector, the people that are unemployed. And so 2 days ago, we heard from our Venezuelan speaker, Professor Jade Tsui, that in the 80s in Venezuela, you had 60% of the population being in the informal sector or being unemployed, whereas Venezuela has all these oil resources, etc. So now we are talking about the question of the dispossessed, those that couldn't even be offer themselves for exploitation with their wage labor. So this is a very serious situation, and I think the pandemic also is helping in a way to wipe out populations at the periphery. So this is a major human disaster that we are seeing, and I feel that this requires very radical changes. So now, for example, we hear people talk about global common good. So, for example, many countries now have been saying, and China has been saying, that the vaccines should be a people's vaccines. They should be made into a global common good. And I feel that the efforts to recover the common, to defend the common, to be at the hands of the local communities, that is one of the primary struggles that we have to fight for. And in this fight for managing the commons, then of course the question about food sovereignty is in the center. So I think today we try to, well, of course we don't have time to go into the details, but I feel that questions about agency, that having food producers as the main agent, as the with the subjectivity as the main subject of history at this conjuncture of crisis, I think that we should be elaborating more. The question about degrowth and deurbanization, the questions about learning from the indigenous communities and the local communities as to how to manage well, human values and how to have a human subsistence, and the whole question about being critical about anthropocentrism and also different ways of relating to nature. I think all these are on the agenda, and they are not separate from each other. We need to see them in a holistic way. So it involves struggles on the cultural, economic, political, and different arenas. And so I feel that that is why it is also so important for us to have these exchanges among communities in the global south, these exchanges with our friends in the north, as to see how our struggles, despite all the differences in our situations, we share certain things in common. And the common agenda is to have a future for humanity. And there's such a lot that we can be learning from each other, that we could be, that we should be fostering solidarity with each other in our fight against our common enemy, which is the finance capitalism.
Thank you very much, Kinchi. So Jade, maybe a final comment from you.
In Chinese, 危机, we have two meanings. One is crisis. On the other hand, it also means opportunities. And then for us, it is also opportunities to rethink the TCM, the traditional Chinese medicine, how it is subjugated in modern medical system. And because we found that TCM has a good effect in dealing with COVID-19, but this is not, there's not so widely report on the importance of TCM. So Kinchi and I also try to explore how TCM is subjugated in the long history of the modern medical history, and also how the Western capital manipulates not only the food system, but also the health system. So COVID-19, thanks to COVID-19, also give us an opportunity to fight for not only food justice, but also health justice. So we hope that starting from reviewing the history of TCM, we can also fight for the not only, rural reconstruction, not only fight for the peasant agriculture, but also the popular, the traditional medical justice. So food justice should work together with the health justice. Yeah, thanks COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for this opportunity to join us and have these insightful interventions. We want to invite all the people that have seen us to consult all the recordings of these conferences and the interviews as well of the webinar on the channels of organizations involved, CLACSO TV, comunalizarelpoder.com.de, and hit the CLACSO Economías Populares Facebook page. We again, thanks a lot to Kinchi Lau and Jade Margaret Tsui for this opportunity to join with us. It has been really an honor to have this conversation and have a whole landscape about Asia, but also a dialogue with Latin America and the rest of the global South, but especially to have the opportunity to have this inside view of China. I would like to say the other China, because most of the time, what we can see from here, from Latin America, it's another kind of China. Maybe the mediatized China from the point of view of the West, from United States. So right now we have been able to see another China from the inside, from people who fight for an alternative. So it's kind of very important for us. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much. We have actually learned a lot from Latin America, from Africa, and from our Asian communities. And there is still a lot to learn from. And we hope that these exchanges and this solidarity could continue. And thank you again for inviting us.